Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to today's story. Stay tuned for part 2 of our story, where Mark's decision will lead him down an unexpected path. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to today's story. Stay tuned for part 2 of our story, where Mark's decision will lead him down an unexpected path. The next morning, Mark sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills in front of him. His mind was racing with Eleanor's offer. The weight of his debts felt heavier than ever, the letters piling up with overdue notices and threats of foreclosure. He couldn't escape the reality of his situation. His mother's medical bills were mounting, and his sister's tuition was overdue. The thought of losing everything, of disappointing his family, was unbearable. As much as he hated the idea, Eleanor's offer seemed like the only way out. Mark picked up his phone, staring at her message again. He had barely slept, tossing and turning, wrestling with his conscience. Was it really a good idea to accept this deal? Was he ready to give up his dignity and marry a woman he barely knew, just for financial stability? He thought about his father and how he had always told him to stand tall, to never take the easy way out. But what was the alternative? A life of struggle, a constant battle to stay afloat? It felt like there was no other choice. He took a deep breath and called Eleanor. His finger hovered over the screen for a moment before he pressed the dial button. She answered after the first ring. Stay tuned for part 3 of our story, where the consequences of Mark's decision begin to unfold. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur for Mark. He had signed the contract, agreed to marry Eleanor, and now he was preparing for the event that would officially change his life. The thought of walking down the aisle felt surreal. He had never imagined he would find himself in a situation like this, marrying someone for security, not love. But the clock was ticking, and the weight of his decisions felt heavier with each passing day. Mark spent most of the days between meetings with Eleanor and her lawyer, preparing for the wedding that was now only a few days away. Eleanor was meticulous in her planning, ensuring that everything was arranged down to the smallest detail. The venue was luxurious, the guest list carefully curated, and the media coverage arranged. Mark felt like he was being swept along in a current he had no control over. He had no idea what to expect from the marriage, but he knew that Eleanor was a woman who never left things to chance. The night before the wedding, Mark found himself alone in his apartment, staring at the suit laid out on his bed. He ran his fingers over the fabric, a symbol of the life he was about to step into, a life of wealth, power, and a woman he barely knew. He thought about his family, about how they would react when they found out. His mother would never understand. She had always believed in love and commitment, and here he was, about to marry for reasons that had nothing to do with either. Mark shook his head, trying to push away the guilt that settled in his chest. He had to do this for his family, for his future. He couldn't afford to keep struggling, to watch everything slip through his fingers. The contract was his way out, and the wedding was the final step. He was doing the right thing, wasn't he? The next day, the wedding took place in the grand ballroom of one of the most prestigious hotels in the city. The place was filled with guests dressed in elegant gowns and sharp suits, their conversations a soft hum in the background. Mark stood at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt more out of place in his life. Eleanor walked down the aisle, her presence commanding the room. She was everything he had expected: graceful, poised, and powerful. The crowd's attention was fixed on her, and Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. As she approached him, their eyes met for the briefest second. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, something that almost resembled hesitation, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The ceremony was quick, professional, almost mechanical. The vows were exchanged without emotion, just as they had agreed upon. "I do," Mark said, the words leaving his lips with an almost robotic quality. He felt nothing. Eleanor's response was just as devoid of feeling. "I do," she said, her voice steady. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Mark felt a strange sense of finality. The deal was sealed. They were now married, but the reality of their union had not sunk in. The wedding felt like a business transaction, nothing more, nothing less. As they walked down the aisle together, Mark glanced at Eleanor, his new wife. She was every bit the powerful woman he had imagined, yet there was something about her that felt distant, unreachable. He wondered what her real motivations were. What did she expect from this marriage? He knew she didn't want love, but what did she want from him? The reception was a blur of champagne toasts, laughter, and congratulatory remarks from guests Mark barely knew. Eleanor moved through the crowd with grace, accepting compliments and making polite conversation with her guests. Mark, on the other hand, found himself standing at the edge of the room, feeling like an outsider at his own wedding. As the night wore on, the weight of the decision he had made began to sink in. He had given up so much: his pride, his sense of self, and for what? To be part of a world he didn't belong to? He couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. He had traded his freedom for security, and now he was stuck in a marriage that was nothing more than a contract. But then, as the music played and the guests mingled, Eleanor approached him. She stood by his side, her gaze fixed on him with a look that was both calculating and thoughtful. Mark nodded, unsure of what to say. He was trapped in a world that wasn't his own, bound by a contract, and yet, something about Eleanor's words lingered in his mind. What was she really thinking? What was the future going to look like for them? Stay tuned for part 4 of our story, where Mark's understanding of his marriage begins to shift, and he starts to question everything he thought he knew. It had been a few weeks since the wedding, and Mark's life was far from what he had expected. The days blurred together as he adjusted to his new life with Eleanor. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. The luxurious apartment he now called home, the fine dining, the events, the high society. Yet beneath the surface, Mark still felt out of place. He had signed up for a contract, not a marriage, and the weight of that contract was heavy on his shoulders. Mark spent most of his time at his new job, a position he had never expected to land. Eleanor had arranged everything for him. He worked in one of her many business ventures, trying to learn the ropes of high-level finance, but his heart wasn't in it. The work was challenging, but it felt meaningless. He was just a pawn in her world, a world he didn't belong to. Each day, he sat in his office, staring at the paperwork, his thoughts drifting. He still couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. Despite everything, he couldn't help but notice how Eleanor had started to change around him. She was still as composed and professional as ever, but there was something in her eyes now, a softness that hadn't been there before. They began to spend more time together, though their interactions remained distant. Eleanor would check in on him during the day, ask about his work, but those conversations always felt like business, never personal. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the office, Mark found himself sitting alone in the apartment. The city lights twinkled outside, but inside, everything felt cold and unfamiliar. He couldn't help but think about the promises he had made to himself to make something of his life, to make his family proud. But as he looked around at his new life, surrounded by luxury and wealth, he realized how hollow it all felt. The contract, the wedding, it had been a means to an end, but now what? Where was the life he had imagined for himself? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mark stood up and opened it to find Eleanor standing in the hallway, looking as composed as ever. "May I come in?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Mark stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Stay tuned for part 5 of our story, where Mark must decide whether he will fully embrace his new life with Eleanor, or walk away from everything he thought he knew. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling for Mark. He found himself torn between the life he had imagined for himself and the reality of the life he was now living. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, "We're in this together." Yet, he still couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage, though legally binding, was nothing more than a partnership in name. She had her reasons for wanting him by her side, and he had his reasons for agreeing to the contract. But now, as the weeks went on, he began to wonder if there was something more to their relationship, something neither of them had expected. Mark spent most of his days at work, diving into the responsibilities that had come with the new position Eleanor had secured for him. He was learning, yes, but it still felt like he was playing a role, doing what was expected of him but not fully invested. It was a far cry from the life he had dreamed of, the life that had seemed so much more meaningful when he had nothing. As he sat in his office one evening, going over paperwork, he heard a knock on the door. Eleanor stepped in, her presence as commanding as ever. Stay tuned for part 6 of our story, where Mark and Eleanor's bond deepens, and they face challenges that will test the very foundation of their marriage. The days that followed were a mix of tension and uncertainty. Mark and Eleanor were slowly learning to navigate their new reality together, but the strain was still palpable. Mark found himself thinking more and more about what Eleanor had said, about the possibility that there was something real in their marriage. Yet, he still couldn't shake the feeling that it was all part of a grand arrangement, an agreement built on necessity, not love. One evening, after a long day at work, Mark was sitting on the balcony of their apartment, staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, but he felt far from the life he once thought he would have. Eleanor stepped out, her presence as quiet as always. She joined him, leaning against the railing next to him. Neither of them spoke at first, but the silence between them felt different now, more comfortable, less tense. Stay tuned for part 7 of our story, where Mark and Eleanor's growing bond faces new challenges, and the truth about their marriage begins to unfold. The days following Mark's decision to truly try began to feel different. Something had shifted, both between him and Eleanor, and within himself. It wasn't easy, nothing ever was, but there was a quiet hope that had started to bloom in his heart. The tension that had once lingered between them had softened, replaced by a tentative connection that felt, for the first time, like it could be real. Mark found himself spending more time with Eleanor, not just in business meetings or obligatory social events, but in moments of quiet, unplanned conversation. They would have dinner at home, sometimes with no agenda but to talk. And as they talked, Mark began to see a side of Eleanor that he hadn't noticed before, the woman behind the powerful CEO. There was a vulnerability to her, a quiet strength that came not from her wealth or position, but from her ability to persevere. It wasn't what he had expected, but it made him respect her more. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, sipping wine, Eleanor broke the silence. "You've been distant lately," she said, her tone careful, but with a note of concern. "Are you having second thoughts?" Mark looked at her, meeting her gaze. He had been thinking a lot about his feelings, about the future. There were still moments when he questioned everything, when the doubts crept in. But he had promised himself, and Eleanor, that he would try to make this work. And he was trying. He really was. Eleanor smiled softly, nodding as if she understood. "I don't know either," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I want to find out. Together." Mark felt something shift inside him at her words. He wasn't sure what he had expected this marriage to be, perhaps a simple, business-like arrangement. But slowly, it was becoming more. And the idea of together didn't seem so foreign anymore. The next day, Eleanor asked him to join her at one of her charity events, something they had both been putting off. Mark agreed, though he still felt a bit out of place in these high society circles. As they arrived at the event, he saw how everyone was drawn to Eleanor. She was effortlessly poised, commanding attention without saying a word. He couldn't help but feel a little proud, but also a little overwhelmed. The event was filled with influential people, and Mark found himself in conversation with a few of them, trying his best to keep up. But his mind kept drifting back to Eleanor. She was out there, across the room, laughing with someone, her smile radiant. It was then that Mark realized that, for all her power, she was still just a person. And the more he got to know her, the more he saw that there was a side of her that had been hidden from the world, a side that only he had begun to see. Later in the evening, Eleanor joined him. She took his hand, her touch soft, and pulled him toward the balcony, away from the crowd. "You look lost in thought," she said with a teasing smile. Mark smiled back, the connection between them feeling easier now. "Just thinking about how different everything is. I never imagined I'd be here." Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at him. "I never imagined I'd be here either," she said quietly. "But sometimes life surprises you. And sometimes, that's the best thing that can happen." Mark nodded, his heart full of emotions he wasn't quite sure how to handle. It wasn't perfect, nothing was. But there was a growing sense of possibility, of something real being built between them. As the night went on, Mark and Eleanor shared a quiet moment, just the two of them, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He realized, for the first time, that maybe he wasn't just living in a world of contracts and obligations. Maybe, just maybe, he was building a future. And that thought, as uncertain as it was, didn't scare him anymore. Stay tuned for part 8 of our story, where Mark and Eleanor face new challenges and deeper emotions as they continue to build their life together. As the weeks went by, Mark and Eleanor continued to grow closer, though there were still moments of doubt that crept into Mark's mind. He had never imagined his life would take this turn, and sometimes it still felt like he was living in a world that wasn't truly his own. But when he looked at Eleanor, something began to shift inside him. She wasn't just the woman he had entered a contract with anymore. She was becoming something more, a partner, someone he could rely on, someone who cared for him in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, Mark came home from work, his mind exhausted from a long day of meetings and decisions. He was still adjusting to his new role in Eleanor's business empire, trying to make his mark, but it felt like he was always one step behind. The stress of it all was wearing him down, and when he walked into their apartment, he saw Eleanor sitting by the window, her attention focused on a book in her hands. Stay tuned for part 9 of our story, where Mark and Eleanor face their biggest challenge yet, and the true depth of their relationship is tested. Mark and Eleanor had come a long way since that fateful day they had signed the contract. Their marriage, which had started as a business arrangement, had transformed into something neither of them had expected. It had not been easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but they had found something real in each other. Something that was not just about wealth, status, or convenience, but about connection, trust, and the willingness to fight for each other. The night of the charity event, the air was electric with excitement. Mark stood beside Eleanor, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The world around them was glamorous, filled with influential people, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He was here with her, and that was enough. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in this world. He had a place beside her, as her partner, not just in name, but in heart. The evening was filled with speeches, laughter, and cheers, but Mark's mind kept returning to Eleanor. She had always been poised, confident, a leader in every sense of the word. Yet, when she looked at him, there was a softness in her eyes that spoke volumes. She had let down her walls, and in doing so, she had given him a glimpse into her true self, vulnerable, caring, and deeply committed to him. Later in the evening, as the event wound down, Eleanor pulled Mark aside. They stepped out onto the balcony, away from the noise of the party, and for the first time that night, they were alone. As they stood there, holding hands, the noise from the event seemed distant. Mark realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just living to survive or to fill a role. He was living for something that mattered. He was living for Eleanor. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would still be challenges, obstacles to face. But Mark wasn't afraid anymore. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. They had started out as strangers, bound by a contract, but they had become something far more meaningful, partners, in every sense of the word. As the city lights flickered below, Mark and Eleanor stood together, looking out at the future. They didn't know what it held, but they knew they would face it side by side, as a team. And that thought, more than anything, filled Mark with hope. The journey that had begun as a simple agreement had transformed into something deep, something real. And in that moment, Mark knew one thing for certain: he had found a love he never expected. A love built not on convenience or obligation, but on trust, respect, and the courage to take a chance. Stay tuned for future stories where unexpected journeys lead to even more surprising outcomes. Until then, thank you for being part of our story.